This is Talking Drupal, a bi-weekly chat about web design and development by a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal, recorded live on Wednesday afternoons on a Google Hangout. Visit us at talkingdrupal.com. This is episode 133, Wednesday, November 30th, 2016. Debugging. Hey guys, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
It's been a few weeks since we recorded, and we've just finished a holiday week here in the U.S., Thanksgiving, and it's good to be back with you guys. Good to be back at work, actually. And with us, as usual, is John Picozzi from Oomph. John, how was your holiday and vacation?
It was great. We went up to Vermont for the holiday and had a lot of fun. It was actually snowing every day up there, so that was pretty awesome to be able to go tubing and then eat turkey.
Yeah, that's pretty. So you had Thanksgiving in Vermont?
Yes.
Is that a tradition?
No, that's a pretty not typical for us, or for me anyway. Ever since I was a child, we've always been home for Thanksgiving. But this year, parts of my family were traveling to other parts of the country, and I thought it would be a good time to change things up. So my wife and I decided that we would go to Vermont.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like a great way to spend the holiday. I could see that becoming a tradition really quickly.
Yeah, I think we already established that it would probably happen again next year.
Yeah.
It was a little bit interesting because you don't realize how much stuff you need to bring with you when you're like planning to cook a Thanksgiving meal.
Right.
Not at your house.
Yeah.
But it was fine. It was great. We all had a good time, and my son enjoyed being able to go tubing because we don't have any snow yet down here in Rhode Island, but up north in the mountains they got plenty of it.
Well, that's great. And also with us as usual is Nick Laughlin from Enlightened Development.
Good afternoon.
Did you scurry away and hide away from the family for your holiday?
No, we actually had a friend up from Columbia who had never been to a Thanksgiving, so we took her to my parents' house and had a lot of fun. Went to a Celtics game. Thanksgiving is great. It's one of the real holidays in my book. It's one of the holidays that actually freelancers take off, contractors take off. So it's nice to actually get a break.
Wow, you guys don't take like Christmas off?
I take Christmas to Thanksgiving usually, but
right.
like Memorial Day.
Yeah. All of those smaller holidays, Columbus Day, things like that, generally don't happen, right?
Yeah, those are working days. So
yeah,
it's always good to take some time off, take a break.
Yeah, that's great. And for me, my two daughters were home from college, so we had 4 people in the house for the first time in 3 months, so that was fun. All right, well, why don't we move on to our show? We're talking about debugging this week. And before we get to the show, let's do a few other things first. Let's hit our tips of the week. And John, why don't you start first?
My tip is not, well, I guess it's kind of a tip, but I'm going to be an Apple fanboy for a minute. And
you're bragging. This is a bragging thing, right?
No, I'm not really bragging.
Okay.
And tell everybody that I actually went and checked out the new MacBook Pro with the Touch Bar in the Apple Store. And if you're in the market for a new MacBook Pro, check that thing out. It is super cool and super fast and super cool
expensive.
And super fast.
It's super expensive, right?
And well, I mean, it's
there's no equivocation about that.
It's an Apple computer, so yeah, it's expensive.
Yes.
But the Touch Bar is not as ridiculous as one would think. It's super useful, super easy to use, and the keyboard is more comfortable than I think the older generation MacBook Pros. For people are like, oh, well, I don't know if I need a new computer. Why are you going to buy the new MacBook Pro? And, I keep telling them, well, for people like me who have a 2010 MacBook Pro and maxed it out and had put a new SSD hard drive and put all the memory they could in it. It's time. It's time for a new laptop.
Yeah.
And this new laptop is a huge upgrade. Trackpad's bigger. There's more memory in it. I can get 16 gigs of memory, which is awesome. There's a way better graphics card in it. There's a way better processor in it. The keyboard's nicer. It's the keyboard with the less travel. It's also, the keyboard's backlit differently so that you don't actually see the light coming out from underneath the keys. You see the light coming through the keys as it's supposed to, which is pretty cool. So for me, it makes a lot of sense. It may not be for everybody. If you just went out and bought a MacBook Air, like last year or something, it might not be worth it to you. But it's very cool. You should definitely check it out. And that you can consider my fanboy rant over.
Well, if you got 6 years out of your current laptop, you did pretty good, I'd say, right? I mean, that's lots of generations of technology that have changed.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way I like to go with the laptops. Buy them and use them until they're dead in the ground.
I just listened to the weekly MacBreak Weekly podcast. I think you listened to it, John, with Leo Laporte and family. I
don't actually listen to MacBreak Weekly.
Oh, you don't? Oh boy, did he rip this! They've been ripping this new MacBook Pro for weeks. And he recently got one in and is like, the touch bar, I've shut it off. It's useless. The keyboard is not as good as they've been in the past. I mean, they've really...
That's really, really interesting.
They're not... So but keep in mind, they're not coming from a 2010 computer, right?
Right, of course.
He's coming from the latest and greatest all the time. So very different perspective.
So the one thing for the touch bar for me that just seemed more useful, or that made it really click for me, was it's customizable. So you can put anything you want up there. There are different buttons. You can change the configuration, so you can customize it, which right now with the function keys, yeah, of course you can do that, but they all have these icons on them. So gets kind of confusing after a while. The other thing is too, they put a slider in there for the sound. So you don't have to tap a button. You can just slide your finger and increase the sound or decrease the sound. The other thing that was interesting, and they showed this to me at the Apple Store, was if you're using Safari, you open up Safari and you have a couple of different tabs open, the bar will actually show you a preview of each tab right there, and you can click on the preview to go to that tab. So as apps progress and start using this technology, it's going to become more and more useful, which is pretty cool. So I mean, I think, as I said, for somebody that has a year-old Apple computer or has the newest generation, computer, and is just looking at this as a comparison, they're probably going to say, "Oh, well, this stinks and that stinks." But for me, as somebody that's working on a six almost 7-year-old computer, it's kind of a no-brainer.
So you got a 15-inch? 15-inch with a terabyte?
No. So I didn't upgrade the hard drive. That was the one thing I didn't upgrade, simply because
it's not upgradable either, though.
I know, but I don't use the hard drive space. I just don't use it. I've had this hard drive, I've had a 512 in this computer for 6 years, and I think I probably got 200.
Wow. Yeah, I could not live without a terabyte drive.
So
what was your price tag?
I think with Apple Care and a couple of dongles, we were looking at 38.
Wow.
Christ.
Yeah,
you can buy 4 Surfaces for that price, and
that's what they're saying.
Then I'd have to rebuy them in 2 years.
Yeah.
No, you'd still be ahead.
I don't know about that.
And you wouldn't. I have my Dell from 9 years ago, and it still runs.
Oh yeah, how many times you got to format that?
I have
every year. I have to
it once.
I have to reformat it and scan it for malware and virus.
I formatted it once because I went from Windows Vista to 7.
I'm a Mac guy too, but I mean, I think the prices are they seem to be getting higher,
that's absurd.
not lower.
I'm considering.
Yeah.
Let me actually make sure I quoted that properly.
I think you're right, John.
My invoice right here. Hold on.
I'm considering selling my Mac and buying a Surface because my little Mac that I bought last year was overpriced and I don't use it nearly as much. And I can just install Ubuntu on it.
Yeah, I was off by $500. It was 33.
All right, it sounds more right. Yeah, because that sounds more like a hard drive upgrade price. So I'm gonna skip my tip that I had in the document. I'm gonna switch to a different tip here. So and it's related to John's. So my sister, this is just some advice out there. The non $3,300. My sister called me, talked to her on Thanksgiving, or the day after Thanksgiving. And she says, you know what? I need a new laptop, and I want to get a Mac. She says, but they're so expensive, and I'm looking on eBay for just a slightly used one. Do you have any advice? I said, check Craigslist. So her and I went on Craigslist together and took a look. She ended up getting a 2012 13-inch MacBook Pro with 8 gigs of memory, and the person had already upgraded the drive. It was a 250 SSD. It passed all the tests. She spent $500 on it, and it's the model where you can still upgrade everything. So you can upgrade the memory, you can upgrade the hard drive, you can change those primary components in and out. They're not soldered to the motherboard. So she was able to get a decent computer. It's an i5 with 8 gigs of memory for $500. I mean, that's another way to look. If you want to get into the Mac world, is check out the used space. MacSales.com has used laptops there too. Check Craigslist, and then Apple's refurbished section of their website has discounts, but they're only like $100 kind of thing. But worth checking out. So anyway, I look forward to seeing that laptop, John, and checking it out when you get it.
Steve, what do you think? Not to derail the show or make it about buying laptops, but how do you feel about buying laptops off of Craigslist?
It all depends on you meeting the person and going through it. I mean, a laptop is a laptop. There's some utilities you can run that Apple provides and other people provide that checks the battery and does like a system check on it. You can run those utilities on, which is what my sister did, and it either works or it doesn't. When you talk, I mean, it's a risk, yeah, but it's not. That computer was probably about $1,300 new, and it was 2 years old. It was the guy bought it 2 years ago because the 2012 model is what they were still selling 2 years ago. So it was only a 2-year-old computer.
Right.
For what she saved, I think it's a good deal if the customer feels right and the situation feels right. So I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Interesting.
I mean, what could really be wrong with it? I mean, she could find it, and she's had it for a week and it's been working fine. But I guess I worry more about like the malware. I mean, the thing was wiped. The guy wiped it. It was a brand new install, and she did it too. She did a fresh install when she got it. So it was a clean machine. Yeah. Anyway, so Nick, how about your tip?
So my tip is a little bit more programming oriented.
Really?
Yeah. So I think
such a stickler.
So this tip isn't anything specific. It's more general warning. So if you are going to be dealing with dates and time zones, just prepare to be frustrated. They do not work the way you expect them to. Even though those of you nodding your head saying, yes, I figured that out, you're still wrong. They do not work the way you still expect them to. They are probably one of the most frustrating aspects to deal with that I've dealt with in coding things. So I would say my tip is when you look at the PHP docs, there's a little function in the example about the date time zone object that gives a quick example on how to calculate the offset. So I think rather than changing time zones, sometimes using the methods that are available, just calculating the offset and then calculating the correct timestamp from that is sometimes worlds easier than just trying to figure out what time zone, how to set the time zone correctly. And the reason is, now if you're starting fresh with the date, then it actually isn't all that complicated. The problem is there's usually a disconnect between how MySQL stores the date and how Drupal is displaying the date, and sometimes getting that lined up properly when you're trying to convert dates from one field to the other is massively complicated. So my tip is calculate the offset, manually calculate the timestamp, and go from there, and you'll thank me later.
Yeah, it's and there's not a lot of great documentation, blog posts, or anything out there when trying to manipulate dates and deal with dates well. I'm always wondered that because I've had struggles in that area as well.
Well, there is a lot, and it's all wrong.
Yeah, okay, that's what I mean. I mean, I've never found stuff that was very helpful and had to sort of figure it out myself. And it's not one of those things, once you figure out, you know it forever, because when you go and revisit it 6 months from now, you're going to be like, how did this work again?
It's incredibly infuriating.
Yeah, right.
Work with it. From what I hear, this was Drupal 7. From what I hear, Drupal 8 has a little bit better handling with that, but yeah, I was working with Drupal 7 here. Incredibly frustrating.
Before we move on to the our topic of the day, assuming we have time for it, we had a listener send in a question over the past week or so, and it was Sharon, and I'll read her question to you. She says, I've used Filezilla for FTP for years, but I recently read a story on Slashdot that users are getting hacked, and that there was a new version called Filezilla Secure. Is it safe to keep using Filezilla, and what's the differences between them, and which one should I use? So I'm not a Filezilla user, but I did some research and responded to Sharon, and I figured we'd share some of that information with everyone here. So Filezilla is an open source FTP tool. And what's interesting about Filezilla, as I did some research, is that when it stores your credentials, the credentials for your FTP sites on your machine, it stores them in clear text. It's just an XML file. So I guess what's happened before, if someone gets malware on their computer, there's lots of malware out there that goes and looks specifically, hey, let me go see if Filezilla is here, let me go grab those credentials. And there's been users who's had their websites hacked because malware was exposed on their machine, that stuff taken, etc. So it appears that the Filezilla folks have basically taken the position that your operating system is in charge of protecting those clear text files, and it's not the responsibility of the software. So they've never made a change, although people have been complaining about this for years. So some developer took it upon himself to fork Filezilla and create Filezilla Secure, which the only difference right now between those two versions of the product is that the Secure, you have an option to set a master password, and then it encrypts and stores the credential file encrypted on your machine instead. So clearly that's a better approach. The problem you have with this, and you guys chime in here if you got any thoughts, but the problem you see with this is, the problem you have with this first is that the product's been forked, and now for that product to stay up with Filezilla, the developer who forked it is going to need to now keep up with making and moving forward the product as Filezilla updates. So, I mean, that's the first thing to be concerned about. Have you guys used Filezilla?
When I was a PC user, I actually used Filezilla for like maybe all of a week. Even back then, like, and this is probably, I don't know, 10 years ago now. It had some security issues, so I kind of put it down, stepped away from it. At that point, I used something called, I believe it was called Smart FTP, to FTP files back and forth. So that was on a PC. On a Mac, I actually pay for Transmit, which is one of the better FTP programs for Mac. And the reason I pay for it is kind of to avoid those sorts of situations. Transmit is backed by a pretty large company that works on developing it, keeping it secure, and builds in actually support for your Apple keychain and all that sort of thing. So it has the ability to do SFTP, which is secure FTP, which you should be doing anyway. Everybody should be doing SFTP if possible. So, my recommendation is maybe if you're worried about the security thing, maybe backing away from FileZilla. If you're on a Mac, like I said, Transmit's great. I don't know if they have a PC version. I'm going to go with probably not. But
They don't.
But maybe they don't. Okay.
No, I don't believe so.
But you can always look for a PC equivalent. Like I said, Smart FTP was pretty good. I don't know if there's a cost to that now or how that kind of works out.
So the way Filezilla monetizes is it's a free piece of software. What they do is when you go to their site to download, they bombard you with advertisements. And then when you install the product, you have to opt out of it installing a bunch of other stuff on your machine. And that's how they make their money. And I found that doing some research back in January 2015, some of the stuff that they were installing on your computer turned out to be malware itself. So they've had sort of a shaky history, but it seems to be a really popular and pretty good product once you have it installed. So my advice is similar to yours, John, which is what I told Sharon. Is certainly if you're stuck with FileZilla and you just want to continue, certainly use the secure version. Make sure you're using SFTP if you have the ability to do that. And I do recommend finding a pay solution where there's a company and a company behind the product if possible. Nick, you're on a Mac. Well, you're on a Windows PC. What do you use for? Do you have an FTP client that you use?
So I'm not on Windows, actually. I'm on Ubuntu.
Oh, okay. All right.
I've been on Ubuntu for 2 years.
How dare you, Steve?
But yes. I use FileZilla on both. It's a workable product. You have to be aware. You have to be aware that the credentials are stored in plain text. So usually
you have to be aware that it's wicked insecure.
Well, yeah, you just don't save the passwords.
Right.
So you can have it just ask you every time you log in.
Right.
And then, I don't use FTP all that often anyway. It's usually just downloading an archive or something. I'm usually using SSH or Git, to move things around, or SCP or something else. It's not. FTP isn't my primary way of getting files.
Yeah, I know. It's so funny that I rarely use FTP anymore.
Yeah.
I have Transmit as well, John, and I might open that thing once every 2 months, it seems like.
Yeah, no, I don't. Don't get me wrong. I don't open Transmit all that much anymore. But when I used to FTP things back and forth regularly, I would definitely use Transmit. The other thing to think about too is some of your other applications. Like I know Dreamweaver for a while there had an FTP client in it where you could connect to a server and use that to push and pull files. So some of those programs might have FTP clients in them that you could use as well if you didn't want to go out and pay for one or do the research to find one that's more secure.
Right.
I just think it's kind of rough to say, hey, use FileZilla, but just be aware of all these gotchas and all these things you got to watch out for that, if you don't click the right buttons and do the right things, you may be vulnerable to security or security issues or malware. I just think that's, it's kind of unfortunate that somebody would put out a piece of software like that. But
so Sharon, thank you for your question. Anyone else has a question like this, feel free to email us at talkingdrupal@gmail.com. I also want to let everybody know that we do have a Talking Drupal newsletter now that you can sign up for. Just go to talkingdrupal.com. You can find in the sidebar or on any episode itself, there's a place to sign up. So that newsletter will send you the show notes when a show is released and also give you access to some bonus material as it comes out. So thank you to the dozens of you that have already signed up for it. And that information will continue to flow to you. So thanks. And let's get on to our topic of the week. So we're going to talk about debugging. And I mean, debugging is something that we all do all the time. But we thought we'd today just focus on a few areas on front end and back end debugging, some tips that we have and things you could do to maybe make your debugging less stressful and easier.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing that you need to determine when you're debugging is what you're actually debugging. It's important to know if it's something in the front end of the website, so if it's JavaScript or CSS or something like that, or if it's something in the back end, if it's PHP or Drupal, something in the Drupal configuration. So the first step to successfully debugging an issue that's happening on a website is trying to narrow down, what's the root cause before you're even trying to figure out how to fix it. You're just trying to find out what causes the issue and what likely causes could point to that.
And to clarify there, that approach or that working through that could span all of those areas, front end and back end, until you narrow down what is actually causing the issue.
Yep.
Couple of weeks ago, I actually had an issue with search on a site. You'd search for a term with a space in it, and all of a sudden, the site would just spin. You'd never get any search results. So we had to look at quite a few different things. Is it a front end issue with the way that the form is being submitted? Is it a back end issue with the PHP? Is it a server issue with the way Solar's looking at this and performing the search? So, we didn't really know where the issue was, but we had to kind of look at all of the pieces together and systematically put together a list of what the issues could possibly be, and then systematically test to figure out what the issue actually was. So keep in mind that if it at face value looks like a front end issue, it may not just be a front end issue. It may be a back end issue that's kind of manifesting itself as a front end issue.
Yeah. So another example of where that could be the case. If you have a layout saying the homepage is overlapping and it doesn't look correct, your client says, "Hey, we need this to be fixed." So the first step of debugging is looking at that and saying, "Hey, it's probably CSS or or something like that." So you could, look at the CSS, see if that fixes it. But it could also be backend, because if you have a custom module that's outputting that layout and it has mismatched HTML tags, for example, it's possible that it's actually the PHP that's causing that issue.
So let's talk about the steps.
Yeah.
Generally that you'd go through.
Yeah. So we have. So I think we're coining this term. I don't know if this came from anywhere else. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I wasn't sure where that came from, by the way.
We're going to call this the RIR strategy.
Okay. Which stands for what?
RIR stands for reproduce, isolate, and resolve. So the first thing you need to do anytime you want to successfully debug something is figure out what the correct steps to reproduce are. If you can't reproduce the bug, you can't be certain that whatever you changed has fixed it.
This is often a really difficult thing to get to. I mean, sometimes this is the biggest hurdle, is once you can reproduce it, the actual cause of the problem may show itself much clearer once you've gotten to that point of being able to reproduce it.
Yes, and really common. Many times when you notice a bug and you can fix it, it's pretty straightforward to figure out how to reproduce it. It's more of an issue many times when, and this is something that when you're meeting with your clients, part of the onboarding of your clients should talk about a way to produce a good bug report, and part of that is steps to reproduce. Because many times your client will just send you an email saying, "Hey, we have this problem on this page," but for steps to reproduce, possibly you need to be logged in as that user, or you have to be on a laptop, or you have to be on a Mac, or you have to be on a phone.
And maybe that's a note for all the clients out there. If you want to be a really good client to your development team, when you encounter a bug, maybe you send them an email that doesn't just say, "Hey, there's a bug and here's a screenshot," but
Yeah.
"Hey, there's a bug and here's the browser that I was on and here's what I was doing." And
And this is what I was doing before I did this is usually helpful too.
And any pertinent information that can help them reproduce it, because in Jira there is a option when you go to close a ticket that says cannot reproduce. We hate to use that, but every so often there are issues that we just can't reproduce, and the more information we have, the faster that we can try to reproduce that and get to the bottom of it. The other thing is too, it cuts down on the back and forth, because if we have more information up front, we don't have to go back and ask you for it and take time trying to figure out what really caused the issue in the first place.
Yeah, and sometimes trying to reproduce it yourself before sending that email is really helpful as well. Because sometimes especially in Drupal, one thing that's really common is just clearing cache sometimes causes some intermittent things to go away. So sometimes just trying to reproduce it yourself. Maybe you missed a step, or maybe what you thought caused it didn't cause it, and that will help you get to the bottom of it too.
And if you have a customer that's been around a long time and they send you an email about a bug, they'll often lead it off with, "I cleared cache and that didn't work, so now I'm emailing you."
Right. Another important step is to sometimes not any of our clients, of course, but sometimes clients will encounter a bug and they just need to get something done. So they'll figure out a way to work around the bug. And then they just won't report it for a few months. So if you have a bug that's been around for a while and you're just getting to work on it and you have a workaround, make sure you explain that workaround as well. Because sometimes saying, "Hey, there's this bug here, but we can still get what we're trying to get done if we go over here and do this instead," that can sometimes shed a lot of light on what's possibly behind the actual bug. Because if something works one way but doesn't work the other way, it's a really, really good sign of where the problem lies.
So the first step in our RIR strategy here is train your customers to report things to you properly. So when you first get a bug, teach them how to tell you what's wrong, and that will go a long way.
I guess it is a little bit of training, but I would say, make up a form, make up some sort of template document that they can look at. "Oh, I need to put in a bug because I found this." "Oh, they need to know my browser. They need to know this. They need to know that." Because, ultimately, as I think Steve was saying, with the time zone issue earlier, right? The fact that people aren't doing this all the time, they're going to forget the things they need to send you. So creating a little template for them to use when they need to send you an email or a communication about a bug is very helpful, if you don't have a tool like Jira that they can use.
Would you generally agree in the IRR, if you can't get past R, you can't get to I? Like if you can't reproduce it, it's almost impossible to fix it.
Absolutely.
And you need to set the expectations properly in that area. It's like, if we can't reproduce this,
I think maybe 2 months ago, I had an issue where we could not reproduce it. We tried everything. We tried different browsers, different computers, different people, different places. Could not reproduce this issue. And I think it's probably been the first issue that I have not been able to reproduce in probably about a year, but could not reproduce it. And the client was able to reproduce it, consistently. But ultimately, we worked it down to it being an issue specific to his computer, not to anything else, which is a possibility, and you should keep that in your mind, in the back of your mind. But ultimately, the issue, we just closed it with could not reproduce, because we couldn't really reproduce it. We couldn't actually define what the issue was. So I definitely think that if you can't get to the reproduction part of the rear process. I'm going to make a little lion emoji that's going to be a mascot for this rear. If you can't get to reproducing it, you're really not going to be able to move much past that.
Yeah. So the next step in the strategy, the RIR strategy, is isolate. And I agree. If you
come on, Nick, say it. Rear.
I think we can actually make it better if we call it RRIIR. We can call it report, reproduce, isolate, investigate, and resolve. How's that?
How do you say that?
You've already lost me.
So anyway, isolate is once you've reproduced it, you need to start isolating the actual cause. That's when you start to, by the process of elimination usually, and this part will become faster the more you debug things because you'll be able to shortcut some of these things. But isolation is where you start to really eliminate what possible causes there are. So for example, if you want to see if it's front-end thing, many times just changing the theme to Bartik, or if you have Bartik, changing the theme to another theme will help you determine if it's a front-end thing or not.
And a lot of times on that note, using Bartik is a good call because it's a Drupal default theme. So all the pieces, in theory, unless you've done something you shouldn't have, I'm not pointing any fingers, but just saying, shame on you, should work great because it has all the right pieces in place. So that's usually a good way to go.
Yeah. So that's one thing to do. Change a theme. You can try. You can really start to, by the process of elimination, determine where it is. The next step, if you determine it's the back end, you want to start using some sort of debugger, usually Xdebug, and start stepping through the code and determine where the bug is actually introduced.
So one thing I want to do, I want to clarify a little bit here is, once you're able to reproduce the issue, you have an understanding of what is quote unquote causing the issue. You may put together a list of potential issue or potential causes for the issue, and that's what Nick's talking about here is trying to isolate down that list as to one ironclad thing that is causing the issue. But put that list together and maybe work with another developer to kind of troubleshoot, like, hey, I'm having this issue. Is there, could you help me come up with a list of possible problems here? That's actually what we did when we were having that solar search issue, and we came up with 10 things that it could have been. So then we had to work through those 10 things in this isolate step to figure out what's what.
Something that I want to mention back on the first R that we didn't mention here, and we should, is that oftentimes reproducing the error means it's an error that happens in production, but you can't make it happen in a QA or a dev environment. So having a strategy where you can replicate the production environment in a different place is often required to track down some kinds of bugs, because it could be related to data or the environment that the production server is sitting in. So being able to reproduce that is handy.
Exactly, and that's not always the most straightforward thing. I mean, sometimes, for most Drupal sites, it's just having MySQL, the same version of PHP. Actually, that's a good point. I recently had an issue
PHP
with Drupal 8 where I used Composer to install this particular module because there were a couple of library dependencies, and that was what was recommended. And it was working locally, and then when I pushed it up to the server, it wasn't working there. And what it ended up being was, this should be a tip of the week in the next couple of weeks, but
too late.
What it ended up being was that Composer downloads clones the Git repo of the libraries. So even though the folders are being generated, the actual files for the libraries weren't put in place. So generally, the quick fix is just to run Composer update on the server. But the problem was I was using a different version of PHP locally and on the server, so I was missing a specific PHP module that I needed in order to be able to run those libraries. So in the end, I was able to get it fixed by installing that PHP module and then running.
Just so you know, there's a flag you can actually use for Composer to ignore platform requirements. It's Composer require whatever your command's going to be, and then -- ignore - platform - reqs.
Yeah, so that works many times for a lot of things, but in this particular case, the library I was using required a PHP module I was missing, so that wouldn't have helped.
Oh,
the PHP version is a really good point. I had this in the past 7 days myself, same issue. The development server was running on PHP 5.4. The production server was running on 5.3. Updated MailChimp module, worked fine on development, pushed it to live, broken because it requires 5.4.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's a way to, paying attention to PHP is something to maybe put higher up your list when you see kind of wacky things going on.
Makes you want to go back and listen to the Vagrant show that we did a couple of weeks ago,
right?
About getting a local environment that mirrors the production environment set up, because a lot of these issues are not issues if your local environment mirrors your production environment.
Yeah.
So going down the isolation list, as you're working through your potential issues or your suspected issues, I think Nick was just about to start talking about tools that you can use to help in that endeavor before I interrupted him. So
yeah, so like I said, when you're trying to debug, there's a lot of tools that you have at your disposal. One of the most important ones over the last year or so that have come up last year or so for me has been Xdebug. Just being able to stop the code at a specific point and see what the state of the application looks like is one of the most important things that you can do. Sometimes, though, you don't have access to that. Again, if you're having an issue in a production environment, you're not going to have Xdebug enabled there and a connection there. So you're going to have to use something like Devel or Kint possibly, although you really shouldn't have that enabled.
I mean, this is where it comes to reproducing. You probably need to reproduce something outside of the production environment to fix it in most cases, right?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you should have a stage server that's running that's a mirror copy of the production environment, or just a local environment. The good thing is that if you can't reproduce this locally, that you know that it's more likely a server related issue or an environment related issue than bad code or some sort of syntax error. But yeah, you should definitely, I think you should definitely be reproducing this locally as opposed to trying to debug on any sort of production machine.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you're right, Stephen. This still kind of falls under reproduce. But it's part of the step of isolating it as well. Okay, so I guess the final step here is to resolve. So this is the part where it starts to get fun. Let's assume you have an issue on the website that you can reproduce locally. Because you have a good report from your client. You've isolated this in the back end, and you know what section of code is causing the issue. It's time for you to fix that. So sometimes it's very obvious. You look at something, there's a typo, or there's bracket missing, or quote, or something like that. Sometimes it takes a little more work. Sometimes you have to refactor it. But the resolve piece is very much an iterative process. Usually it's you make a change, you then refresh the page, and debug it again and take a look and see what changed. And then you incrementally get closer to solving the issue. Once you've solved the issue, it's important to confirm that. Sometimes you get yourself in a position where it looks like you've solved it, but you really haven't. So test the resolution that you have, and then you can commit that change and push it up.
I feel like we've gypped the conversation here a little bit on the techniques and things to track down stuff and figure things out. So I want to just jump back to that a little bit, like the types of things that could happen and the ways to figure them out. So like there's listed here, we have inspector. So you should be using inspector. I mean, I think everyone uses it at some point to like sort of look at CSS and look at HTML, but there's a couple of other tabs in there that are super handy, like console, the section in Chrome. I'm not sure what it's called anywhere else, but we'll show you JavaScript errors. So a lot of times there could be a JavaScript problem. It might be on your site. It could be something that you're downloading from another place and it's not available. And it might not be super obvious, but if you look in the console, you'll see JavaScript errors in there. That's one place to look.
It'll also show you items that aren't able to load or things that are being blocked due to security reasons. On
the network tab, you would see that in Inspector. Yeah, you can see everything.
The console will show you that as well. It'll show you all errors as opposed to just JavaScript errors. The one nice thing about that is a lot of times clients will say, "Hey, this page is supposed to load, over secure connection, but it's saying that there's unsecure content. What's going on?" And you'll know that you will have built that page to obviously work under that, under that scenario, because that was the requirement. One thing that you'll look at is you'll look at the console and you'll go through and you'll say, "Hey, this JavaScript file is loading this third-party tool from this other source that's not secure." We've had multiple instances where a third-party JS file is actually loading another script from a non-secure connection. And we've had to go back and talk to that provider and figure out how we can get those connections to be secure. So yeah, I definitely think, the inspector and the tools in there are definitely really useful for troubleshooting a multitude of issues.
And you can't also forget going and check your logs, right? I mean, one of the first things you should be looking at when there's error messages, or not even error messages, but problems with the website, go do a status of your Drupal modules. Take a look in there, run the thing, and see if when you run the status report, you could see that there could be some issues somewhere that might show up. Could be a permissions problem somewhere. Take a look at your database logs, whether you're logging them in the database or in a log file. Go do a tail on that log file and reproduce the error. Take a look at that log file, and the error message could be plainly stated right there is exactly what the problem is.
Exactly. And sometimes if you're getting like a white screen, you can actually turn on error reporting for PHP. So instead of getting a white screen, you actually get a printout of what the error is.
So another thing.
So I was just going to say too, if you're getting a stack trace, which is more and more common in Drupal 8 than in Drupal 7, usually the most important line is right at the top. Right, so you'll get a stack trace and you'll get numbers 1 through 20 or 30 or 50 or whatever. If you're looking at the error log, scroll to the top, right above the 1, we'll usually say, "Hey, class X hasn't been loaded," for example, and then you realize, "Oh, I need to declare cache so that that route will show up or something."
The other thing to keep in mind is think outside the box. I once had this problem, and was working on it with a couple of different developers for a couple of hours. And then all of a sudden I was like, "Oh man, let me try this configuration change. And I went into, I think it was I want to say it was, ironically, I think it was a date time field. And I went in and there were nested checkboxes in this configuration. And I had checked two of the child checkboxes, but unchecked the parent. So I didn't see the children. And this field was not doing what it was supposed to do. So I went back in and I said, well, what's going on? And I checked this checkbox again, and I saw that both of the children were still checked. And I said, I wonder if this is holding on to those settings, even though the parent is not checked. So I unchecked the children, unchecked the parent, and sure enough, the field worked just the way it was supposed to. And, the way that we were expecting it to. And everybody looked at me and said, what made you think of that? And I said, well, I was just trying to think of like what I had done differently than I had ever done before. And this was the thing. So sometimes, recheck your configuration too, because that can cause issues. And sometimes you have issues that you didn't even know you had, like, oh, if the parent isn't checked, the children still apply, which seems weird to me and kind of buggy, but is just kind of a fact of life, I guess. So recheck your configuration too. It's definitely can be.
So another couple of things that you can do too is, one of the big ones sometimes is, pair programming. So if you're having an issue with something, sometimes even if it's something simple as something that you've been banging your head on for a while, just having another developer on a call with you, walking through what the issue is, sometimes will give you, they'll be able to give you an idea or spot a mistake that you're making or provide something. So to that end,
or just the fact that you're explaining it to someone else sometimes opens up what the solution is just from explaining it to somebody else.
That's my favorite. That's my favorite type of debugging, rubber duck debugging.
The other thing to do there too is walk away, which sounds like an absolutely terrible idea. But if you've been banging your head on something for a couple of hours and you're not really making any headway, walk away from it. Go home, eat dinner, have fun with your family.
Even if it's 10 in the morning.
Come back. Maybe not that early, but come back to it in the morning. I can't tell you the number of times that I've had an issue and I've just been like, what is the answer? What am I missing? What am I not seeing? What's going on here?
Sure.
Where, just getting a good night's sleep, waking up in the morning on the drive to work, I'm like, oh my God, this is the problem. Yeah. I know the solution. And you come in and you're like, oh man, here's the solution. Awesome. Great. Works. Can check this one off today. I don't have to worry about it anymore.
So the next time you want to leave the office early, just tell your boss you're debugging.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep, absolutely. So I think one final really important tool to use, and this kind of falls under both the isolation and the resolve piece, is if you think you're at the point where you know where the bug is and you're trying to fix it, sometimes the bug is due to the formatting, possibly, or maybe you're using the wrong method to manipulate some data, for example. So the tool that you should use is just Notepad. If you have, for example, with the time zones, if you're not sure what format or what time zone you should be offsetting from, for example, write down all the different examples of possibilities, all the different ways you could possibly form. So, for example, you need to input a date. Most dates in Drupal can just be put in as a timestamp, but sometimes they require, depending on the contrib module you're using, sometimes they have to be put in a specific format. It might be year, month, date, day, hours, etc. Write down the different possibilities for the format that you think might resolve the issue and check them off the list as you try them. Make sure that you're not repeating yourself. Because if you don't write it down, and by the third or fourth time you're trying this, you'll forget whether or not you tried the month, the day first, or if you did year, day, month, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important that you keep track of what, if you're trying to eliminate the possibilities, keep track of what possibilities you've already tried.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so just document what you're doing as you're doing it, right?
Yep.
And well, Nick, you said that was the final thing. I wanted to add one more in here. It sort of relates back to getting the bug reported from the user. Oftentimes, I'll go back to the person who reported it, and although they're not coding, they don't know anything about the back end or the front end or the JavaScript. Sometimes a simple question of asking them, do you have any, if you had to guess at what was causing this, do you have any ideas? And oftentimes there'll be a clue there somewhere that might help you out.
That's a good point.
All right, so let's wrap up the show today with the module of the week.
So the module of the week this week, I think, is mine, and it is one that I suggested, and it is the Search API. So the Search API module is an extremely powerful tool that allows you to override and integrate with a bunch of different search tools. So if you want to get rid of the core search and you want to use Solr, for example, Search API has a bunch of helper modules that can tie you into Solr and give you a lot of configuration options for setting up, for fine-tuning how your search works. If you don't want to use Solr, for example, you don't have a server where you can configure. You don't have a server where you can configure Solr, or it's just a little bit beyond your skill set, but you still want a better search than is provided by Core. You can use the Search API database module, and it gives you it kind of gives you the in-between Drupal core search and Solr. So the Search API module is a great module. This Drupal 8 version gives you integration with views with a submodule, and it makes it a lot easier to integrate with external searches.
Nick, question about the Search API database module. Can you use a separate database than your Drupal database?
I'm sure you can. I mean, I've only used it once, so I didn't spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. But I seem to remember it being an option.
Interesting.
You could always just add a second database, and I think there's a hook that you can override what database is being used.
Sure. It also lets you tie into a couple of different search options too. So you could use Elasticsearch or something like that as well.
Yep.
And if you do really want to use Solr, but you're afraid of it, there are also services out there where you can buy a Solr server already configured and everything for you. I have no idea how much it is a month. From what I remember, it was pretty reasonable. So that could be an option too. Search API is great.
Great. So let's wrap up this week's show. John Picozzi, if people would like to reach you or learn more about you, where could they do that?
Oh man, so many places. They can do that on the interwebs, all the major social networks at John Picozzi. And they can do it any day of the week at oomphinc.com.
Great. How about you, Nick?
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN. Send me a message.
Great. And I'm Stephen Cross on Twitter, at Stephen Cross with a PH, or parallaxinfotech.com. And you can always email us at talkingdrupal@gmail.com and sign up for our newsletter. And talk to you guys soon.
See you guys soon.
Have a good one.
Bye.